The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 4772. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 4772, number 3 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to elections, providing for policy and technical changes to elections and campaign finance provisions, the first engrossment.
There are amendments at the desk. If there are no objections, we will let the author explain the bill before we act on the amendment. To the author of the bill, the member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This came up sooner than I was expecting, but hopefully I'm sufficiently prepared. We'll find out, I guess. So members, before you is House File 4772, the Elections Policy Bill. This bill corrects historical wrongs and federal mistakes. It improves clarity of how our elections are influenced, and it expands voter access for eligible voters. It includes several meaningful bills. First of all, it includes Representative Greenman's Voting Rights Act, an extremely important piece of legislation in light of a misguided federal court decision. Vice Chair Greenman will discuss this legislation in greater detail as this debate moves on further. The bill includes Representative Agbadje's prison gerrymandering legislation, another very important piece of civil rights legislation that Representative Agbadje will discuss as we move further along here. It includes Representative Purcell's bill that will improve voter turnout on college campuses. It includes Chair Stevenson's bill to strengthen protections against deepfake crimes, and it includes important pieces of legislation from Representatives Coulter, Hewitt, Kraft, Vernig, and yours truly. We will be spending a lot of time on amendments, so I will keep these remarks very short. We will discuss, I'm sure, many of these provisions in greater detail, so I look forward to the discussion on the amendments and a robust debate. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Franzen is moving to amend House File 4772, the first engrossment as follows. This amendment is coded A36.
To the author of the amendment, the representative from Douglas, Representative Franzen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Members, this amendment deals with the chain of custody with our ballots. I think we all must agree that we want to make sure that our ballots are secure and accounted for every step of the way. There are some best practices that I think we as a body should adopt from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, certainly not partisan. The chain of custody refers to the processes or paper trail that documents the transfer of materials from one person or place to the next. Every state and local jurisdiction has its own controls for ensuring the chain of custody of election materials is properly maintained. And according to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the chain of custody process varies by jurisdiction, but there are a few key questions to keep in mind when developing your chain of custody materials, such as, where is the item that is going to be transferred? Are adequate safeguards in place? Who currently has access to this item? What makes this item unique? When and where is this item being transferred? Date, time, location. Where is this item being transferred to? Who is transferring the item? What is the condition of the item to be delivered? Who witnessed this transfer? When and where did the item arrive? What is the condition of the item upon receipt? All extremely important. And this is kind of lacking in our election laws. In fact, cannabis has higher controls than we do on our ballots for the chain of custody. When it comes to transporting medical cannabis, we have all kinds of rules and regulations. We have a medical cannabis manufacturer must use a manifest system approved by the commissioner to track shipping of medical cannabis. And the system must include a chain of custody that records the date, the name and address of the destination, the weight, measure, or numerical count and description of each individual package, the date and time of the medical cannabis shipment, and on and on. I won't belabor the point. You can look that up yourself in the Minnesota rules. But I believe that we need to choose whether or not we are going to protect our ballots stronger than we do weed, marijuana, Mary Jane. So, members, this amendment would say that we are treating ballots at least as well as we treat marijuana. Thank you.
There's an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Freiberg moves to amend the Franson Amendment to House Bill number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment to the amendment is coded A40.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for offering this amendment, Representative Franson. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. The amendment does reference a report from the Election Assistance Commission. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but that is a national commission, and not everything in the report applies to Minnesota. So the secondary amendment makes it clear that the best practices referenced are applied only to Minnesota law. I hope it will be considered a friendly amendment.
Discussion to the amendment to the amendment.
Well, members, I would prefer a little bit more robust chain of custody, but I do believe that it moves us in the right direction. Thank you.
The representative from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. This is the first opportunity to point out how partisan this bill is. You know, if we had heard some Republican bills, we could have discussed this in committee and worked through the issue, as we have on many other committees in this legislature. When Representative Freiberg listed off all the bills in this that are contained in this omnibus bill, you will notice that there were no Republican authors, not one. This is precedent-setting. In the past, elections has been the bipartisan committee. In fact, governors in the past have demanded that election bills be bipartisan, and this one is not. And this is a prime example of how we could have worked through an issue that is important to the electors of Minnesota and failed. Let's have a roll call, Madam Speaker.
Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The member from Chisago, Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Ooh, I think my microphone works now. Some people are saying yay. You know, Representative Franson, thank you for the underlying amendment. We take a lot of pride in the state of Minnesota and how we do our elections. And one of the things we should be proud of is the fact that we have paper ballots. That provides a lot of security, that provides some assurance that even if errors are made, we have a paper trail and we can correct those things and we can make sure that things are done right in the state of Minnesota. That's a good thing. And frankly, Representative Franson's underlying amendment just makes sure that there's some protection of those paper ballots. That there is a chain of custody to ensure that there's no funny business. This is really easy. This is not even hard. I don't know why anyone would want to neuter an amendment that just provides security for our ballots. Like, what are we doing here? And yet, this amendment to the amendment does just that. It neuters Representative Franson's amendment on just making sure that the paper ballots we have are secure. I cannot for the life of me figure out why anyone would not want that. Why anyone would take away from this amendment. I'm glad that Representative Torkelson asked for a roll call on this because it seems really obvious. And I think we should absolutely, I'm glad we are going to have it on the record. Who thinks that we should care about the security of our paper ballots and who doesn't? Because that's what this is about. I suspect that almost half the people in this room are going to say, yes, of course, we should make sure that there is a chain of custody and that there is security for our ballots. But somehow, my little brain tells me that half this room is going to say, no, we don't care. We don't care. That's not a priority for me, which, frankly, I cannot fathom why that would be the case. Why that would be the case. And frankly, thank you, Representative Franson, there aren't even any costs to this bill. We're not even spending money that we don't have. We're not even spending money, which was the right way to do this. And yet, I suspect that half the people in this room are going to say that we don't really care that much about the chain of custody, the security of these ballots. So thank you, Representative Franson, for your hard work on this and caring about a really simple security measure. Thank you.
Representative Franson.
Thank you, members. Sorry, yeah. Okay, so the U.S. Election Assistance Commission was created in 2002 and is an independent agency of the government. We do accept HAVA funds here in Minnesota. So if we're willing to accept financial assistance for our elections, don't you think perhaps adopting best practices for a chain of custody when it comes to our paper ballots should also be taken into account, not just the money that comes into Minnesota? So members, I'm going to ask you to respectfully oppose the amendment, because this amendment that is being offered to my amendment only makes my amendment, it neuters it, and basically neuters it. And so members, we're gonna vote no on that. That is what I am asking you to do, because our election, our paper ballots, deserve to be treated better than what is currently being done. Thank you.
To the author of the amendment to the amendment, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a very broad statement to say that this secondary amendment neuters the underlying amendment. If you read the language of it, it says these best practices have to be applied only to methods of in-person and absentee voting, voting systems, ballot tabulation, and audits and review that are explicitly authorized by Minnesota election law. That pretty much covers voting. There are some, this language was recommended by the Secretary of State's office. There are some methods of voting, such as provisional balloting, that are used in other states but are not used here. So the secondary amendment just makes it clear that the best practices we're talking about are those authorized under Minnesota law, and I would encourage members to vote yes on this amendment.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will recall the names of the members voting remotely.
Engen.
Engen votes no.
Engen votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 68 yeas and 63 nays, The motion prevails, and the amendment to the amendment is adopted. To the underlying amendment. Discussions. Representative Freiberg.
Thank you. With the amendment, I would encourage members to vote yes. Maybe, Representative Torkelson, this will maybe even make the bill be considered bipartisan.
Further discussion. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker and Representative Freiberg, for your feeble attempt, but this is not really a worthy attempt at making this bill bipartisan, and I'm looking to the author of the amendment to see what she's going to do.
Representative Franson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I request we pull the amendment.
Representative Franson withdraws her amendment. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Franzen moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A34.
To the author of the amendment, the member from Douglas, Representative Franson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, this is a really easy amendment. So basically, right now in law, state law, we have 46 days to vote. I call it an election season. This bill brings us back to where we were previous to 2013. So we would just have a 1 day of voting, one ballot, one person, no absentee, ballots for everybody. We're not mailing out ballots to everybody. And we also make it a state holiday. So it's a state holiday. This has been talked about many times. We have the state holiday. People can have off of work and we can go vote and make it fun and make it a party. So members, I ask you to vote yes on this very important amendment. Thank you.
There's an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Greenman moves to amend the Franson amendment to House File Number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment to the amendment is coded A39.
To the author of the amendment to the amendment, the member from Hennepin, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What this amendment does, and I share the intent of Representative Franson, that Election Day should be a holiday, and it should be something that we celebrate and that welcomes everyone in. I also think that early voting, early absentee, and no excuse absentee are important to create that thriving democracy where everybody can vote in a way that makes sense to them. This amendment, the underlying amendment, would eliminate that, would eliminate early voting. It would eliminate no excuse absentee, which folks in all of our districts use. But our amendment to the amendment would keep and make Election Day a holiday. So if you want to make Election Day a holiday and join Representative Franson and I at that party at the polls, please vote yes.
Discussion to the amendment to the amendment. The member from Morrison, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And while I can appreciate Representative Greenman and her comments about having a holiday on Election Day, frankly, I don't really trust her words. If she was put so much effort into writing this underlying bill, I'm surprised that we don't have this language in here already. Something could have happened along those lines, and so frankly, I'm just shocked to see an amendment that basically guts Representative Franson's amendment. I think we had plenty of topics of debate last session about the idea of just stripping one another's amendments and leaving nothing behind. There's no purpose in that, members. There's no purpose in hitting delete all to our amendments. And so I'm just rising with a concern to that for this body. If a member brings forward an idea, an amendment to a bill, we should be able to have a vote and a discussion based around the confines of that amendment and not stripping out one another's ideas all in favor of picking one idea in the amendment. I realize we all have the ability to amend each amendment every single time that a bill comes up for debate on this floor from now until the end of session. But it's ridiculous to delete each and every one of the major points of a given member's ideas, all for the sake of not having a vote on the issues. You're completely avoiding a vote on the issues that Minnesotans care about when they want to ensure that our elections and that our election policy in Minnesota is bipartisan. You haven't earned bipartisan support on this bill because you didn't seek to. You're seeking to jam through a piece of elections policy in Minnesota right now that only takes in the input of one half of Minnesota. One half. And frankly, we don't even know if you have that kind of support. But instead, we're bringing forward amendments today, amendments to the amendment that simply strip out all of the good ideas and all of the policy provisions that Minnesotans deserve to hear where you stand on these issues. So count me shocked that you're in support of a holiday on Election Day when you could have included it in your bill.
To the member from Dakota, Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Greenman yield to a question?
Representative Greenman will yield to a question. Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Greenman, you're encouraging to make it a holiday for voting. I appreciate what Representative Franson's trying to do is narrow the scope and tighten up the integrity of elections. With a long, elongated number of days for voting, which actual day would you prefer to make it a state holiday?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Koznick. When I look at the language of the amendment, the underlying amendment, it says the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in an even-yeared election. So I'm just looking at the language.
Representative Koznick.
Well, Representative Greenman, thanks for the clarification. I wasn't sure because what really has happened is we've expanded the number of days that people are able to vote, which actually makes it more suspicious for election which day to actually vote on. I know some people prefer to have some of those options, but by stripping Representative Franson's amendment and you wanting to just have a holiday, I think your intentions are different than what was left of the amendment, that you want to make a number of days of voting holiday. Members, I appreciate Representative Franson's intent to make our elections more secure and more full of integrity. So thank you for that, Representative Franson.
Representative Franson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, the author of the elections bill, Representative Greenman, has made the point for the Democrats. They oppose the measures in the amendment. They oppose election integrity. But instead of stripping my language and keeping Election Day as a state holiday, you could simply just oppose it and vote no straight up, instead of neutering, once again, my amendment. So members, I'm going to ask you to vote no, because I am not willing to say, yay, a state holiday, if we are not willing to also get some assurances of election integrity along with it. Thank you.
To the author
And
of the
I'd like a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. To the author of the amendment to the amendment, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate this discussion. We actually had a vote on early voting last year, and it passed into law. Early absentee, or no excuse absentee, we've had since 2013. And I encourage you to go talk to your elections administrators and ask them how it's working for voters, how it's working for the 30,000 election workers who work in our district, who work across the state. So members, I'd ask you to vote yes on the amendment to the amendment and make Election Day a holiday and preserve the things that people like that's already working. Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Will the clerk call the name of the member voting remotely?
Engen.
Engen votes no.
Engen votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 68 yeas and 63 nays, the motion prevails and the amendment to the amendment is adopted. To the underlying amendment, Representative Franson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I'm quite disappointed here. We had a chance to put some safeguards in place, make sure that we do have election integrity, but I'm not willing to have a state holiday, election holiday, without the other measures in place, so I'm withdrawing the amendment. Thank you.
Representative Franson withdraws her amendment. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Erdahl moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A35.
To the member from Meeker, Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Let's see if we can break the streak we have going here. This amendment would clarify that school boards cannot appoint when they remove members and create a vacancy. So if they remove a member for cause, they can't just appoint somebody else. This would ensure that school boards are not appointing in situations where they remove members, which may further politicize school boards. So, nice, simple little amendment. Let's see what we can do.
To the member from Dakota, Representative Viernig.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Erdahl, for bringing this amendment forward. This is a good amendment, and I encourage a yes vote, so thank you.
Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Erdahl moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A32.
To the author of the amendment, Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I'm less optimistic on this one. This one is about democracy. It's about keeping elections in the hands of the people. Now, unfortunately, for some, this is the opposite of what is included in the elections bill this year. Appointments within 2 years of the end of the term, and adds that school boards would not be allowed to merge precincts for special elections. This language would do the opposite and focus on the voice of the electorate over that of school boards. So this is your pro-democracy vote. I encourage a yes vote.
To the member from Dakota, Representative Viernig.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and unfortunately, I would encourage a no vote on this one. I think it strips the language of what the bill intent is. Currently, school boards do appoint when there is an opening. They can choose to do a special election or an appointment, so I would encourage a no vote.
Further discussion? Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And members, I would like to withdraw my amendment.
Representative Erdahl withdraws his amendment. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Davis moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment, as amended. The amendment is coded A26.
To the member from Crow Wing, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So this amendment, right now in the bill, the incarcerated persons language would require that individuals be allocated in redistricting to their last known address, regardless of the length of time an individual may serve in prison, regardless of where they reside in the prison, and regardless of whether they are eligible to vote or will return to that address after incarceration. This amendment clarifies that individuals who have had 10 years or have 10 years remaining in their sentence, or who have served more than 10 years, would be counted at the prison, not back where they last resided. So if a person has not lived at a residence in the last 10 years, or will not be living there in the next 10 years, then the only logical conclusion is that that person should not be counted at that residence during redistricting. Redistricting is meant to allocate the population where they currently live, instead of where they might live sometime in the future. The A26 amendment rectifies that, and so I would ask for a green vote. And Madam Speaker, I would like to request a roll call vote.
A roll call has been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion to the amendment. The member from Hennepin, Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I would encourage a no vote to this amendment. By focusing on a person's sentence, as this amendment states, we're continuing to deny an incarcerated person's humanity and their ability to be counted in their home communities by conditioning it on the length of their incarceration. So what I'm hearing in this amendment is it means that someone who has a sentence that is less than 10 years is somehow worthier of being counted in their home community than someone who is incarcerated for longer than 10 years. Also, this type of provision isn't something that we do for members of our community who already live abroad or are serving in the military. They are not denied their count in their own home community in the census based on how long they've been away. Incarcerated persons do not participate in the community of where they are imprisoned, and where they last resided is most likely where they will next participate. And according to our own Department of Corrections, 95% of prisoners will return to their home communities. So the length of their sentence does not change that. I would encourage a no vote on this amendment because it essentially cuts out what this section of the law or of the bill is meant to do. And instead, we are focusing on where people last were because that is their last known home address, which is most likely where they will be going. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Further discussion. Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank Representative Davis for this amendment. I really have to appreciate this, and just for the Minnesota public who are either listening right now or will be listening in the future when they're considering elections policy and exactly what the irresponsible DFL majority did to their state, it's incredibly important that we understand and have an amendment like this that says if there are individuals currently incarcerated for longer than 10 years, that they not be considered for the purposes of redistricting. We each know that currently in the Minnesota House of Representatives, we each represent approximately 43,500 people. But the number of incarcerated individuals and the number of people who are serving out a term that is longer than 10 years could have a disproportionate impact upon the way that we shape legislative districts and congressional districts here in Minnesota. Is something that's incredibly important. It also could impact, county boards, I believe, and the way that they do their redistricting. And so I think that, especially considering the legislation that was passed last year in this body, despite how irresponsible I believe that legislation was, that this is an important provision that we adopt to this bill to ensure that these numbers, as seen while we do redistricting, aren't seen impacting the legislative districts that we all represent. Our legislative districts and congressional districts, the populations change on an extremely frequent basis. All the time, people are moving in and out of communities. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a rural community, a suburban community, or an urban community. People are moving all of the time. And so to use information and data of people who aren't going to be actively living within a given community within the next 10 years, frankly, it's common sense. It's straight up common sense to adopt Representative Davis's amendment today, and I encourage support of that amendment.
To the member from Lyon, Representative Swazinski.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, too, just want to stand with Representative Davis on this amendment. I think it's super important. You know, I think we're really concerned here with the aspect of how this legislation is going to impact host communities. Folks, we're not dealing with innocent people. We're dealing with people who committed crimes, who made a choice with their actions to live where they're living. They made the choice to do the crime. They were convicted by a jury and a judge. We don't need to bend our backs over and say, you know what, we want to make sure you feel good about this. You know what? These folks are here because they deserve to be there. And these communities that are hosting the prisons deserve to have representation in the legislature, in their county commissioners, because these people live in the community. It may not be their choice to live in that community, but they made a choice to do the crime and do the time. And I think that's an important part of this amendment, that these folks are here for 10 years at least, that they're counted in the community in which they live and hopefully thrive. Folks, the Davis Amendment is not a partisan issue. It's not a gotcha amendment. It's a straightforward amendment that recognizes that when people live in a geographic area, that they need to be counted in that geographic area when it comes to the census and the votes, and when it comes to voting. Members, this is super easy. This is like slow pitch softball, wiffle ball, church league stuff. Give Representative Davis your green vote today, and let's do what's right for the host communities that host our prisons. Thank you.
The member from Chisago, Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you, Representative Davis. Frankly, I wish this amendment went further. Because I look at this underlying language, and it's curious, isn't it? We're talking about reallocating incarcerated persons. We're reallocating prisoners, and we are arbitrarily deciding how and where we are going to count these folks for purposes of redistricting. And frankly, the underlying language is contradictory. It's pretty wild. First of all, we're all of a sudden going to say that they're going to be allocated to their last known address. This is frankly bizarre. It's frankly bonkers. A census is based, I mean, I'm a genealogist. I read census records back into the 1800s, right? I do this all the time. Census records matter. And when you take a census, you are literally going door by door and finding out how many people live in the house. And in fact, especially the older censuses, there's some really interesting demographic data that is collected on people. But they really are determining who lives where. And this underlying language says we're ignoring who lives where. We are assigning an address to people who don't live where we are saying they live in this underlying language. We are literally assigning them an address where they do not live. It's bizarre. And then, sort of weirdly and ironically, in certain situations, we're just going to exclude them from the count entirely. What? We're just saying that someone does not exist? This language is bizarre. So we're saying they're not going to exist for the purpose of redistricting, but they will count to our statewide total. Representative Davis, I wish this amendment went further, because at least you're saying, okay, can we add a little bit of sanity back into this? Can we add just a little bit of sanity and say, listen, if someone has more than 10 years remaining on their sentence, we're not doing this silliness. We're not doing this silliness. Now, ironically, the underlying language, we are literally assigning people their last known address. This is so arbitrary. They could get out of prison tomorrow, and we are assigning them their last known address. Well, maybe they already know where they're going. And it's not their last known address. But we are arbitrarily assigning people for the purpose of redistricting. You want to know what this language does? This is backdoor gerrymandering. This is legislating gerrymandering. That's what this is. Gerrymandering is, of course, when we mess around with redistricting lines to create the districts we want. That's what gerrymandering is. This is legislative gerrymandering. This is literally saying we are going to beef up, because of course we know what those addresses are. We know what those last known addresses are. We know what those are right now. And we are legislating that that's what we're going to use. Do you know that right now we can see who's in prison, and we can see their last known address, and we can see how long they're going to be in there for? This is not a blind piece of legislation. This is not blind to current reality. This is legislating gerrymandering. This is legislatively choosing where we are going to place people for the purpose of a census. We are legislatively choosing that we are going to assign people to certain districts. And let me tell you what the effect of this is. If a lot of incarcerated persons, if those folks are heavily weighted towards a last known address in Hennepin County, in Ramsey County, well, all of a sudden, for the purpose of the census, for the purpose of redistricting, those populations are going to expand significantly. And what that means is that those districts are going to push outward. So this is a really good backdoor way to say, you know, let's push some population of Hennepin County. Let's push that into maybe CD6 a little bit. Maybe we can push a little more Democrat vote out into CD6. Maybe we can push a little more Democrat vote into CD3 and really shore that up for the Democrats. Maybe we can push a little more Democrat vote down into CD2. Likely one of the most competitive congressional districts that we'll have in the entire country this year. And the effect of this language is to say we are going to stack the deck. We're going to use legislation and we're going to use prison populations to stack the deck. We have no idea where these people are going to live. We don't get to choose that. But we're going to assign them to these locations. We are going to assign them to these locations. And the effect of this is going to be, like I said, let's push more Democrat voters down into the 2nd congressional district. Again, one of the most competitive congressional districts in the entire country. Let's stack the deck. That is what Democrats are doing with this underlying language. It's kind of a sneaky way to do it. I give you props on your creativity here. But the effect of this language is stacking the deck by randomly assigning where you think people should live. Not where they do live, where you think they should live. Folks, this really is crazy town. This underlying language is crazy. You are codifying gerrymandering with this underlying language. That is literally what you are doing. And Representative Davis's amendment says, can we just have a little bit of sanity here? Can we just all agree that if their sentence, if they have more than 10 years remaining in their incarceration, and what that means by saying 10 years, that means they will not even be included in the next in the next census. They won't even be included. That means in the next 10 years, they absolutely will not live at the address that you are randomly assigning to them. That's what this amendment does. 10 years. In that 10 years, the random addresses that you're assigning to these folks will never be used by these people. Never. If you can't take an amendment like this, it is because you are unwilling to listen to reason. You are unwilling to see what the folks who have crafted this bill are doing. And like I said, I should give you props for your creativity. It's a pretty sneaky way to do it. But make no mistake, you're doing it. You are literally voting to codify gerrymandering. That is what you are doing with this underlying language. And if you can't even say about somebody who is never going to live in that address during this 10-year census period, that they maybe should not be assigned an address, that maybe they should be using their actual address, there is zero integrity if you are unwilling to see that. No integrity. And frankly, there is good reason to count them where they are. There is good reason to count folks where they actually live. And you think about areas that do house prisons. Well, guess what? They have state representatives too. And their state representatives are responsible for making sure that those facilities are running as they should. Their state representatives represent them in those prisons. They represent the facilities. They represent our law enforcement officers. That is their job. That is their job. And you are literally taking that job away from them. It's wild. I served on the election committee for many, many years. I've worked in elections for many, many more years. This is among the most egregious legislation I've seen. This is it. And in fact, frankly, I don't know, I would question, is this even lawful? Like, the census means something. The census is a federal program that means something. And we are taking that census and saying, well, we're just going to randomly apply this differently. It's wild, folks. Representative Davis, thank you for your amendment, for at least acknowledging that for the 10-year period that this census applies to, that we can at least acknowledge where folks live for that 10-year period. Thank you for that. This is an easy yes vote. And if you vote no, you are voting to gerrymander.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think I heard my ears right, but I'm pretty sure I just heard previously a comparison between people that have been incarcerated and our brave men and women in the military, of whom their votes many times are questioned because it takes these overseas ballots a while to get here, and sometimes there's a certain party that doesn't like actually having to count those votes. But I also have a broader question as to this last known address business. So you're incarcerated, your last known address was 1234 Main Street. I come in, that house is sold. You were renting it, the incarcerated person was renting it, then the landlord sells that home, and I come in and buy 1234 Main Street. But the government says that Joe Prisoner resides at 1234 Main Street. So I'm like you, Representative New Brindley. This census is a federal program. Is that some violation? I mean, you're saying that someone that actually doesn't live there lives there now. Are they going to have squatters' rights? Because there's a federal program that says that's where they reside. What about that? Thank you, Representative Davis, for this amendment, because what you're doing with this is you're trying to make it harder to cheat. Harder to give the wrong information to skew the census towards one particular party. So thank you for bringing it. I would hope that this will get challenged in court. And I know the other side doesn't like to hear that, but as we've learned from last session, when we bring that up, that this could get challenged, and you deny that or you move forward, well, we've got 3 lawsuits going right now that we know of from past issues that you've brought that, we told you so. Members, this is a common sense amendment. Please vote for it.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And would the author of the underlying bill yield to a question?
She will yield.
Thank you.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What if the address no longer exists?
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Quam. So we do go in the bill, it does talk about how the addresses would need to be verified, because the purpose of the reallocation is actually to allocate those numbers back into those census blocks and those districts where people came from. So that's really what would happen. So if the house no longer existed, the person would probably still be going back to that area. But regardless, that's what would be where they were known to come from for any other type of services that they would need upon release that are based on their location. So that's what would happen. And then finally, in some cases too, some folks may not want to give their address for safety reasons, and so then they would be included in the statewide count.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So the residence would be the middle of a highway, because we frequently, when we add interchanges and do other work, we take out houses. So it could be in the middle of the highway, which means it's sort of silly. The definition, underlying definition over the decades has been, where do you sleep? Because there are multiple occasions when boundaries are drawn and redistricting is done, it divides an apartment complex. It's even divided part of a house. And when it comes down to defining who lives in what district, it's where they sleep. And frankly, I think common sense says this is not at all logical, especially when you reject an amendment, which means they're not going to be there for the entire period of redistricting. So a person that's never going to live there is affecting how you redistrict. You know, I think enough has been said so that the public that's watching realizes that there is no logical reason to do this, no justifiable reason, and it doesn't stand up to long existing definition of what district you're in. So I guess it doesn't matter to some people that it just is, well, we should vote for this amendment, but we should really not have this section in that bill. Thank you.
The member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering if the author of the amendment would yield.
He will yield. Representative Kresha.
Representative Davis, as I look through your amendment and as I've gotten to know you, you really have come down here with the heart of bipartisanship and trying to work together. You've really worked hard for your community. And as I look at this, I'm wondering, we've seen a lot of irresponsible and unaffordable legislation. This amendment doesn't appear to fit in there. Have you seen any bipartisan election bills since you've been here?
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Representative Kresha, for the question. Well, I'm sure my colleagues across the aisle will disagree with this, but no, I have not seen bipartisanship, and I have especially not seen bipartisanship work across the aisle, coming together in the middle, working together on the Elections Committee and on our elections bill, where the Democrats' own governor said, hey, if there's one area we need to have bipartisanship in, it's elections. This goes back to last year. I brought forth an amendment saying that organizations can't go out and hire people to ballot harvest. And if they do, it's going to be a felony. You amended my amendment to make it a petty misdemeanor, which we find out that county attorneys, I mean, they even have a hard time going after gross misdemeanors when it comes to certain things. They're certainly not going to go after a petty misdemeanor. And we all voted yes on that, and I know you are. See, look, we put your amendment in the elections bill. Same thing happened here on the floor today with this good Representative Franson. She brought forth a good amendment that could have easily had bipartisan support, and you gutted her amendment. And I know well, I better be careful what I say because I don't want to invoke personalities, but I can't help but think, Representative Olson, that later you're going to be thinking, see, we offered them an opportunity to have bipartisan support on something when you gutted her amendment. Madam Speaker, that's wrong. I thank you, Madam Speaker. Your bill does have bipartisan support. We just saw that previously. Thank you so much for that. That should happen in elections as well. You are setting rules in the state of Minnesota for redistricting. I even heard a representative in Elections Committee on this particular bill say that, isn't it nice that when we actually do redistricting, we'll have bipartisan support. It'll be a bipartisan effort, I think was what was said actually. And I had to point out in committee, yeah, there's only one problem with that. When you're setting the rules for redistricting, you have zero bipartisan support. It's one-party rule, one-party control. That should never happen in our elections, folks. One party setting the rules for the entire state. I hope to God Minnesota holds you accountable for what you're doing. Thank you for the question, Representative Kresha.
Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Davids. I was looking for a yes or no, but that was a way better answer. Representative Davis, I just want to thank you for that. Your amendment reaches across the aisle. It looks for that bipartisanship. It looks to take us into an area where we can have agreement. I would suggest a green vote on the amendment.
The author of the amendment, Representative Davis, if you have more to say.
I certainly do. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I know you were looking for a yes or no answer, but I'm a preacher, so I can't really help it. But again, I'll just point out some really good things that have been said here. Redistricting is meant to allocate the population where they currently live instead of where they might live. And Representative Agbaje, you are a kind representative. You are. But this misses the mark. We're talking 10 years. If the person gets out of prison, it'll be okay because it'll be time for redistricting again, and they then will get counted. This doesn't make any sense. This is a very common sense amendment right here. Representative New Brindley, I just want to point out that you brought up some good points. I will tell you, it rubbed me a little bit the wrong way that you said my amendment could be better. That's my own pride. I apologize. But again, I'm sorry, but the majority party set a rule that we can't fix it on the floor, that we can't, make it better on the floor. And you know what? I'm just having this light bulb go off. It's really hitting me, I think, for the first time of why it's a bad idea for that rule to be in place, offering amendments 24 hours before, because this floor is meant for debate where we figure stuff out together for all of Minnesota. And we could do that right here, right now. So thank you for pointing that out. Thank you for the idea. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about it right now. This floor is so sacred. It's meant for public debate. This floor is meant for bipartisanship. And we're negating that today on this House floor. Representative Scott, you brought up some really good, you are a smart representative. You brought up some really good points on how this bill hurts Minnesota. Thank you for those examples. And Representative Agbaje, like I said, you are a very kind representative, but this missed the mark. And you, twice, I heard you while you were talking. Twice you did this, that you can't guarantee that the person will live in that district. You used words like probably, most likely. I'm sorry, that doesn't meet the mark. We need to base redistricting on facts, not maybes, not might-bes, or probablys. I actually wrote it down. They would probably go back to that neighborhood was the term the words you actually used with Representative Quam. Please bring bipartisan support to this tonight and vote yes on this amendment. Because you have not done that yet. I will remind you that adding amendments to our amendments, gutting our amendments, is not bipartisan. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, we spend a lot of time and money every 10 years doing a count. I served on the redistricting committee and understand some of the ins and outs of that work. In fact, there was legislation passed, I believe, just last year that would make it a little bit easier for census workers to actually make an accurate count of the citizens of Minnesota, and it's important. It's extremely important. In fact, we barely hung on to our 8 congressional districts this last time around. We were so close to losing one. It was just a matter of under 100 people that would have made the difference. We could have, instead of New York losing a seat, it could have been Minnesota. And in a few short years, we'll be counting again. And we'll need to count as accurately as we possibly can and count as many bodies as we possibly can, legitimately, of course, all across this state so that we have a chance of retaining those 8 congressional districts. But there's other impacts from redistricting and counting. You often hear in the news media and here in the House chamber that counting every person is important because of the impact of allocating government funds. The number of people in each district has a direct impact on how those funds are allocated from various sources to various districts across the state of Minnesota. So just imagine that you are the community that has a prison in your district. There are costs involved there, maintaining that facility, making sure the roads are plowed and that everything works properly so that prison can function properly in your district, and you have expenses. But yet we're going to allocate some of those folks out to other districts, which will reduce the number of folks living in that particular district where the prison is and increase the number elsewhere, even though they're not actually living there, but they're consuming these services in the district they're in the prison. And it's not just within the prison, it's the entire community. So there's a direct impact here on our communities, and it's important that we recognize that and not just arbitrarily reassign folks to places that they don't necessarily even live and very likely may not live once they're out of prison. This is a big deal. Redistricting is a big deal. Counting every citizen in this state is important, and making sure that they're counted in the location where they receive the services they need is also important. Thank you, Representative Davis, for bringing this amendment forward. I think it's an important one. The 10-year cycle is not just coincidental. It's tagged with the redistricting cycle, which is also 10 years. It makes sense. I do agree with you that if we could do this on the fly, we would probably dig a little deeper, but the amendment as it stands is worthy, and I encourage members to vote green.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Will the clerk please call the name of the member who has not yet voted?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Altendorf moves to amend House Bill number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A28.
The member from Goodhue, Representative Altendorf, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, members. Today I rise to offer the A28 amendment, and this is for Representative Engen, so I am proud to offer this for him. This is an amendment that I do believe if we took a poll of Minnesotans, both Democrat and Republican, this would get equal bipartisan support. One thing we hear over and over is people are tired, they are weary of our elections, of the negativity of all of the money that's being poured in and put into these elections. So very simply, this amendment prohibits nonprofits from political expenditures in the campaigns. And I hope Chair Freiberg finds this to be a friendly amendment. As I said, this truly is something I hear over and over from people in Minnesota, that they are tired of the election process. There is a lot of wasted money, and there's a lot of influence. So the A28 amendment, again, it's going to prohibit the nonprofits from political expenditures.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. I'm going to ask members to vote no on this amendment. The big issue with this is it's almost certainly unconstitutional. It includes a blanket prohibition on expenditures for any political purpose. The Supreme Court uses a least restrictive means test when governments attempt to restrict speech, and that would likely be overbroad as part of that. Nonprofits are already governed by federal law that dictates whether they could spend money on campaigns. Nonprofits incorporated as 501c4s, 5 and 6s can do political spending. These are civic leagues, employee associations, labor and agricultural unions, and business leagues. Nonprofits incorporated as 501c3s cannot make political donations, and this is where our state direct appropriations and grant money would be directed. Even where 501c3s and c4s are affiliated, the law treats them separately and is the purpose of that distinction. So under this proposal, a grant to a 501c3 would not prohibit a 501c4 from making political contributions. And also, it's kind of bad policy to say to nonprofits that receive state funding, you can't participate but exclude other major spenders like the major nonprofit spenders, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Realtors, and the American Hospital Association, which are the 3 largest lobbying spenders in 2023. Not to mention, there's no limitation on corporate spending. The piecemeal approach to spending restriction does not get to the heart of the problem with money in politics. Citizens United and the cases it unleashed need to be overturned and the power of regulation returned to the people. Representative Hollins, I don't see her on the floor unfortunately, but she has a great bill and there are still 12 spots left on it. It's House File 1064. It's a congressional resolution to overturn Citizens United, which would allow Congress and the states to place spending limits on corporations, nonprofits, and unions. She offered to work with the GOP members to find language they liked. We should encourage them to work with her and look forward to seeing their names on the author's list. In the meantime, please vote no on this amendment.
Discussion to the amendment. Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I am disappointed in that. I also heard you say this was unconstitutional. Maybe one of the other members might want to speak up on all the bills that have been passed here this last year that are unconstitutional. That would be a great talking point. But I just want to speak a little bit to this a little bit more, is the factor of nonprofits. This Minnesota State Legislature last year in 2023, in our cash bonding bill, funded $185 million of nonprofits. In all of the bills combined, we funded over $1 billion in nonprofits. I think Minnesotans would be very concerned that their tax dollars that are being collected by the Minnesota state government, that the majority party then is picking and choosing the nonprofits that they are funding with your tax dollars, over $1 billion, and then by simple searches on campaign finance expenditures, you can see that those nonprofits are then funding the majority party's campaigns. Minnesotans would be very, very concerned to see that their tax dollars are being used in this nature and that there's no concern of the majority party of what's happening with those dollars. It almost seems like a bit of a money funneling system. The tax dollars come in, the party that's in control funds the nonprofits.
Point of order, Madam Speaker.
Please state your point of order.
Masons 124, paragraph 1 or paragraph 3, excuse me, it's not allowable in debate to arraign the motives of a member.
I will just remind the body that it is not allowable to arraign the motives. Representative Altendorf.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. I think there is some other people that would like to speak on this issue, and I do know, again, that I hear over and over from citizens of Minnesota, moderates, independents, and Democrats, that they are tired of this election process. They are tired of all of these political dollars being wasted. That is a fact, and I do believe that by far the majority of Minnesotans would not agree with their tax dollars going to nonprofits and then going into people's campaigns.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Altendorf moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A37.
The member from Goodhue, Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members. This amendment, again, we're dealing with one of the things that we hear all the time. Citizens are very concerned with the money that is coming in to campaigns politically being used. So this amendment, the A37, is private donations and grants may not be applied for, accepted, expended, or used in connection with any primary election or referendum. And just to be noted, we are not asking for something that is just out on a whim. In fact, just in the last week, Wisconsin has now become the 28th state to ban these private donations being used in our elections process. And so again, I think the citizens of Minnesota would expect the same of our state, and we would also ban these private donations for influencing us.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Altendorf. I'm going to ask members to vote no on this amendment. This language has been around for a few years, and it responds to an issue that quite simply is not a problem. The grants this language was created in response to were awarded by the Center for Tech and Civic Life. The grants were open to every jurisdiction, did not request or require any partisan information, and each government that applied received some funds. And since then, this program has been discontinued. The reason jurisdictions applied and the reason the funding exists is because of financial strains on election administration. Without the funding, many more jurisdictions would have delayed reporting of results, which would have further contributed to misinformation. We have election infrastructure funding that we passed last year, but we had a small target and it's not enough. This amendment would put an artificial barrier in place of cities and counties that administer our elections. The language in this amendment is also very broad. It could prevent other nonprofits, including churches and schools, from providing in-kind donations like space, food, and drink, or volunteer staff to set up and work on Election Day. Please vote no on this amendment.
Discussion. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm just so thrilled to hear that the chair is now concerned about the cost of running elections, when there are many provisions that have been sponsored by the DFL that will actually increase the costs of running elections for all of our local governments. The 18-day window for early voting, for instance. There's another provision coming out in this bill that requires a polling place to be set up at any college campus, no matter how complicated the jurisdiction is of that campus, how many districts it might cover. Counties and other local election administrators are going to be saddled with increased costs. And you're right, you didn't give them enough money. It's going to have to come out of their budgets and possibly impact some of the good election work that they have done in the past.
Representative Altendorf.
Madam Speaker, I would like to request a roll call.
Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, this is coming from the 2022 election. In many other states, you know, they refer to it as the Zucker bucks that came into the 2022 election. For the people that do not know, that is $420 million that was infused into our elections, where Zuckerberg and his wife funded these elections privately. When you vote for this amendment, you are saying in Minnesota that our elections are not for sale. If you vote no on this amendment, you are saying that the Minnesota elections can go to the highest bidder, the billionaire that's willing to put the most money into our election systems, that can put their foot on the scale. A no vote is saying that the Minnesota elections are fair, the Minnesota elections are for sale. Please, members, today, vote green, give confidence back to our voters, bring transparency back to our voters, bring fairness back to our voters so that they have confidence in our vote. Please vote yes.
The clerk will take the roll. Will the clerk please call the name of the member who has not yet voted?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. Members, there's a motion at the desk. The clerk will report the motion.
Long moves that Rule 3.33 relating to amendments must be pre-filed be suspended for the purpose of offering the Quam 827 amendment to House File Number 4772, the first engrossment.
The member from Hennepin, the Majority Leader, Representative Long.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am offering this motion to allow us to take up the 827 amendment for Representative Quam.
Discussion to the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion prevails. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Quam moves to amend House File Number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A27.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this amendment goes to another core principle for me on voting, in that I believe that only Minnesota voters should determine who our electors are. Outside votes from other states should have no impact or influence upon the choice of our electors, and so this amendment would repeal the national popular vote section. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to ask members to vote no on this. This amendment would repeal the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact statute. We adopted this last year and enacted it into law, and there is no reason to repeal it now. This is a provision with bipartisan support. It just adopts a policy saying what most Americans expect of their elections. The person with the most votes should be elected president. National popular vote is consistent with the values of our republic, or our democracy if you prefer. We, the people, elect a president, and we do it in a way where every vote is equal and every vote is relevant, including votes here in Minnesota. Let's be clear what the national popular vote does. It will ensure that every voter in every state will be politically relevant in every presidential election, regardless of where they live. This ensures the vote of every Minnesotan matters. National popular vote is an exercise of state sovereignty to make every Minnesota voter relevant in presidential elections and ensure the presidential candidate who receives the most vote wins. Please vote no on this amendment.
Discussion. Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And, frankly, I learned in history class in my public school that our nation was founded and empowered by the states. The states set up our federal election process, and the states put in a little bit of balance, population versus state. That's found with the House of Representatives and found with the Senate. And the actual federal process and how we were founded and how we've been for decades has been electors by the state. Proportional to population with the addition of 2 electors per state. And frankly, last year, we did pass something that wasn't, I think, consistent with the founding and the running of our federal government, and that's why I'm asking for a yes vote on this amendment. Thank you.
There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's a motion at the desk. The clerk will report the motion.
Long moves that Rule 3.33 relating to amendments must be pre-filed be suspended for the purpose of offering the Quam 829 amendment to House File Number 4772, the first engrossment as amended.
Representative Long, to your motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This would allow us to take up Representative Quam's A29.
Discussion. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Opposed? The motion prevails. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Quam moves to amend House Law number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A29.
To your amendment, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this amendment's pretty straightforward in that it would require, actually, it would have Minnesota follow federal law for elections. Once again, it is federal law, part of the HAVA, Help America Vote Act, to have provisional balloting. Over 96% of the people that live in the United States have the option of provisional ballot, which is designed to prevent disenfranchisement, which means everyone that comes gets to Thank you, Madam Speaker. I could take it up from a 1 or 2 level up to about a 6 if need be. But it comes down to the fact that federally, provisional ballots are required by federal law. It's meant to prevent disenfranchisement, so everyone that shows up gets to cast a ballot. Now, it's the vast majority of the states. In fact, some people in committee said, well, this will affect same-day registration. Well, if another state has, and they have, had same-day registration and provisional ballots, Minnesota ought to be able to figure out how to do that. And if the vast majority of the states are doing it, it should be part of our process. Minnesota's one of 3 states that were granted an exception to the law. I think it's past time that we actually abided by federal election law in HAVA and had provisional ballots. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Quam. Thank you also for not going up to a level 6 on the volume. I've had some experience with that, so appreciate that. So I'm going to ask members to vote no on this. Representative Quam, I know you said Minnesota ought to be able to figure out how provisional balloting and same-day registration should be able to coexist, but the place to sort of figure out those sorts of issues is not on the floor. Provisional balloting does functionally eliminate same-day registration, which is safe, secure, and voter-friendly. And moreover, it's in large part why Minnesota has the voter turnout, the best voter turnout in the nation. And just regarding HAVA, we are compliant with HAVA because HAVA has a waiver process, and we have a waiver. So please vote no on this amendment.
Discussion. The member from Crow Wing, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Same-day voter registration does not make our elections more secure. There you are, Representative Freiberg. I had a direct conversation with one of our election supervisors that I represent, and they actually pointed out to me with hands-on experience right down in the trenches saying that's where voter fraud is going to happen, is on same-day voter registration. You know, the thing that our Secretary of State says is the crown jewel of Minnesota. It's okay to keep your crown jewel, but the provisional balloting makes our elections more secure. It makes our elections secure in regards to same-day voter registration. That actually is the point of provisional ballots, because right now what happens in Minnesota, people will go and register on voting day that aren't supposed to be registering in that precinct, and then they vote, and their vote gets counted. And then weeks later, when the system catches up to them and figures out that, oh, they weren't supposed to vote here, their vote is not then taken away from the count. That's wrong. We need to bring security to our elections, especially when it comes to same-day voter registration, folks. Again, I had an elections supervisor in the state of Minnesota tell me this is where election fraud, voter fraud, is going to take place. Let's fix it right here on the floor tonight, folks. Green vote on Representative Quam's amendment. And I would ask, and I'm sure you were going to ask, for a roll call vote on this amendment.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The member from Asante, Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, members, Representative Quam, thank you for this amendment. It's an important one. It deals with voter integrity and the integrity of our elections. For those of you who don't know, this stuff happens, sometimes unintentionally, like what happened in my district. We had a voter that thought they lived in one of my cities, showed up, did same-day registration, got their ballot, did all the voting, voted for from president right down to county commissioner and city council. An hour later, they came back and they said, whoops, we made a mistake. We don't actually live in town, we live over here. A totally different county. We don't have provisional ballots. Do you know how they resolved it? The two election judges went over to the ballot machine, unlocked it, and randomly pulled a ballot out. Not the ballot that the person cast, somebody else's ballot, somebody else's votes were disenfranchised because we don't have provisional ballots. I don't know about you, but that is 100% wrong. I also know that we have many same-day registrations that are returned because it's undeliverable. It's a parking lot. It's a swamp. There's nothing there where they say they live. We used to get a report from the Secretary of State's office as to how many were returned each year. Guess what? We don't get that anymore. We have no clue. The counties, when you talk to the county auditors, they say it's the Secretary of State's responsibility to keep track of this stuff. Secretary of State says, no, it's the county auditors. We don't know. That's something that needs to be fixed to make sure those names aren't on the voters' roll if they don't live where they say they do. But the importance of provisional ballots to make sure we have election integrity, to make sure that people live where they say they live, that they live where in the proper jurisdiction where they're voting, is important. It's important for every one of us, not only in our elections, right down to the local level. Because we've had elections where people have won by one vote. We've had elections that were a tie, we had decided by a flip of a coin. But if somebody voted improperly, should that vote count? Should it count if they don't live where they're voting? And should their ballot be left in the machine while somebody else's ballot was removed, taking away that person's actual voting right? This is not just about the integrity of the elections. It's about the right of the people to vote and make sure that their vote actually counts. Thank you, Representative Kwan. This is very important, and I'm glad we have a roll call on this because it is important to make sure of our integrity of our elections.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and slight correction to some of the previous statements that members have made. Many provisional ballots are counted. I haven't seen the exact statistics, in some states most. So saying it doesn't allow a person to vote It's actually the opposite. And if you look at the discussion and the passage at the federal level, this actually allows a person that didn't have the documentation with them, etc., whatever reason that there's a question, to cast a ballot. So Minnesota's smart enough to do what all these other states are doing. So I have confidence in Minnesota. Vote green.
The clerk will take the roll. Will the clerk please call the name of the member who's not yet voted?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's a motion at the desk. The clerk will report the motion.
Long moves that Rule 3.33 relating to amendments must be pre-filed, be suspended for the purposes of offering the Quam A30 amendment to House Bill number 4772, the first engrossment as amended.
Representative Long, to your motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This would allow us to take up Representative Quam's A30.
Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion prevails. The motion is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Quam moves to amend House Bill number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A30.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this ties in with one of my core principles in that it allows electors, you get 2 per state, that would be given in Minnesota with this amendment. The statewide winner would get 2. And then the remaining ones, 1 per congressional district, would be assigned by who won that congressional district. Oftentimes there have been close elections, and frankly, it'd be nice to show we respect the voters in each congressional district and assign 1 voter or 1 elector for those voters, for the winner of that congressional district. There's another state, actually there's a couple of states that do something like this, and I hope for a green vote. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Quam. I'm going to ask members to vote no on this amendment. The Electoral College is broken, and this proposal does not solve the problem, which is why we passed the National Popular Vote Act last year. 48 states, including Minnesota, award electors on a statewide basis, a decision made by red, blue, and purple states. Ironically, the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, is now fighting to have one of those 2 states, Nebraska, switch to a system where the statewide winner takes all of the state's electoral votes because he knows he might lose the vote in the Omaha district. So I assume he'd be intellectually consistent and also oppose this amendment, so I look forward to many members on the other side voting no. But as long as we're going to keep electing the highest office in the land by a different method than every other elected office.
Point of order, Madam Speaker.
Please state your point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Point of order, inflicting the names of a previous president.
Continue, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was worried there was a rule I had no idea existed. As long as we're going to keep electing the highest office in the land by a different method than every other elected office, we might as well use the system used in 47 other states rather than attempting an even more complicated and untested method that former President Donald Trump also opposes. Please vote no on this amendment.
Discussion. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Freiberg, I'm really glad that you support President Trump. I'll just say that President Trump is not in this House tonight, and he doesn't really have anything to do with state government. So let's support Representative Quam's amendment and vote green on this. Thank you.
Further discussion. Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And anyone that's served with me for a while realizes that I tend to be independent in my thought and base things on, the principles, and also the people in my district contact me. And so on this, I differ with a different Republican. Just like the people that when they had the motion to allow us to have this amendment, I think I might have heard a couple of Republicans oppose that motion. But please support this and say aye.
All those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Torkelson moves to amend House Law number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A38.
The member from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll keep this short this evening. So we know there's a big problem with the Uber and Lyft situation, but we also know that people in Minnesota use Uber and Lyft for a variety of purposes, not just to get from the airport downtown, but to get many places, including the polling place. I think it's really important that we understand the impact of this potential void in transportation services, and this amendment merely asks the Secretary of State to study the impact of ride services on polling and getting folks to the polling place. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Lead Torkelson, for the amendment. I'm going to ask members to vote no on this amendment. This is a very clever attempt to tie the elections bill to an unrelated item that's been in the news, but at best I would describe this amendment as premature. So it presupposes that, just quoting from the amendment, the loss of reliable rideshare service networks is something that's definitively going to happen. We don't know that. We shouldn't be speculating via language and amendments on the House floor. So members, please vote no.
Discussion. Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I'd like to request a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call.
And thank you, Representative Freiberg, but this is a real possibility. It's in the news every day. I think we should take it seriously, and I urge members to vote green on the amendment.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Will the clerk call the name of the member voting remotely?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 64 yeas and 67 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Niska moves to amend House Law number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A25.
To the member of the amendment, the member from Anoka, Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. The A25 amendment is an amendment to isolate and debate what I think is improperly referred to as the Minnesota Voting Rights Act. It's Representative Freiberg, when he was offering the bill, said that this was a reaction to a misguided Eighth Circuit decision. Frankly, I think this is a misguided bill in reaction to that Eighth Circuit decision. It's really not quite ready for prime time, and it's really the effect of it is to expand litigation not only against the state of Minnesota, but against our own cities and counties for the instructions that we give them. It should be a standalone bill, but the point of the A25 amendment is so that we can have an individual vote on that bill. And Madam Speaker, I request a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The member from Hennepin, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And for folks who are looking at the bill, this amendment deletes the entire Minnesota Voting Rights Act. And for members who didn't hear the bill in committee, what the Minnesota Voting Rights Act does is it codifies and strengthens and streamlines the federal Voting Rights Act protections against racial discrimination in voting in Minnesota law. The Federal Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 was passed to ensure that citizens had the right to vote and participate, guaranteed by the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and that those rights weren't denied by race. It is considered the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. That's the goal of the Minnesota Voting Rights Act, too, to guarantee Minnesotans the equal opportunity to participate and to vote in the political process. Enshrining these protections into Minnesota law has always been important, but it is now critical given the Eighth Circuit decision that upended decades of precedent and held that voters themselves no longer can challenge racially discriminatory laws and redistricting plans under the federal VRA. It deletes that entire section, and it removes the ability now of Minnesota voters to be able to exercise that private right of action. Members, this is an important bill to make good on the rights and promises under our Constitution and to make good on the rights and promises to Minnesota voters. I'd ask you to vote no.
Discussion on the amendment. Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Greenman, thank you for the conversations we have had. I certainly understand the desire to state your disapproval of an Eighth Circuit opinion about federal law. I certainly understand that. We could do a resolution, maybe stating our disagreement. That could result in all kinds of interesting conversations about federal implied rights of action or federal precedent. We could ask Congress. We could make a resolution maybe asking Congress to add a private right of action to the Voting Rights Act. But what this does isn't either of those. What this does is takes our disagreement, or the majority's disagreement at least, with this federal interpretation of federal law and tries to import that or create a state law analog to that federal law, or to the federal law that interpretation of federal law that we would like federal law to be. The problem with creating an analog to federal law is that the analogy doesn't work for reasons that Representative Quam has touched on, for reasons that all of us know or should know as Minnesota legislators. And the reason is really simple. We have state election laws, we have a state election system, but there is no federal election system. The only reason we need a federal Voting Rights Act, the way it works, where the federal government allows for suits against state and local governments, is because the federal government can't directly control our state election system. We have a 14th and 15th Amendments that provide certain protections against state action, but the federal government can't just go into our systems and say, hey, Minneapolis, you have to have this certain type of election law. But guess what? We can. We can, because we as the state legislature actually control every political subdivision that this law, instead of just directing Minneapolis or directing Duluth or directing St. Cloud, what this law does is says, hey, all of you, if you don't like something that Minneapolis is doing, at our direction, by the way, at our direction, under our supervision and control, under the state supervision and control, but hey, if you don't like what Minneapolis is doing, applying the rules that we set here, hire a lawyer and sue them, or threaten to sue them, and see what happens. So the analogy fundamentally breaks down, and that results in the wrong tool being used because we are assuming a toolbox that is the federal toolbox that's not as good as the toolbox that we have here. The federal government only has the hammer of the Voting Rights Act. We have the scalpel, every single tool in our toolbox. The cities and counties, the political subdivisions we're instructing, answer to us. So we should instruct them instead of telling somebody else that they can sue the people who work for us, that we are able to control. It'd be like if you went to a store and told the store owner, hey, your employee treated me badly, and the store owner is like, yeah, I'm not going to tell them to do anything different, but you can sue them if you want to. That's what we're doing. That's what Representative Greenman is telling the people who say they have a problem with what's going on in Minnesota. So that's a slap in the face. That's not a real solution. And this is simply not ready for prime time. And if you need any better evidence of that, look at the legislative findings that justify this. It's on pages 46 and 47. Almost all of the legislative findings are about things that happened before 1900 in Minnesota. The one thing that's specific about something that happened after 1900 is about some dude from Tennessee, not a state actor, some dude from Tennessee who threatened some people in 2020 and was enjoined in federal court. That's not a reason to open up our cities and counties to litigation. But let me tell you what this is really about. Because perversely, this is actually, in the guise of being pro-democracy, is anti-democracy. What it's all about is sue and settle policymaking. It's about plaintiffs' lawyers, nonprofits, maybe aligned with a certain side of the political aisle, finding defendants that agree with them and suing them. Maybe it's not totally adverse a lawsuit. Maybe it's the Secretary of State or a city or county. This happened in the abortion context recently. It's happened in the election context recently. It's a suit that's likely to happen in Ramsey County in front of a judge appointed by a Democrat governor. And then if appealed, potentially appealed to the Minnesota Supreme Court to a bunch of justices appointed by Democrat governors. And what it does, the point of this, the real object of this, is to get policy decisions about how our elections are decided taken out of the democratic process here, so we don't get to decide them in an elections bill, but instead decided in collusive litigation and sue and settle litigation, either in front of a Democratic-appointed judge or in a settlement that's, again, outside of the democratic process. So this is a misguided effort. I understand the reaction to the Eighth Circuit opinion, but by using a flawed analogy, by taking it out of that process, this is actually an anti-democracy bill. It's a way to have policy made outside of the democratic process and instead made in the judicial process or in a judicial settlement. It's a bad idea. Vote yes.
Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. Will the clerk take the roll of the members voting remotely?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 yeas and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
NISCA moves to amend House File number 4772, the first engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A33.
To the author of the amendment, the member from Anoka, Representative Niska.
Mr. Speaker and members, the A33 amendment is a slimmed-down, focused version of the previous amendment. It's really focused on the sue and settle aspects of this bill. It leaves in the provisions that deal with voter dilution or vote suppression, the goals that we're establishing for our political subdivisions, but it, again, removes the portions of the Minnesota Voting Rights Act that allow this real strike against democracy by allowing for policy making about our elections to be taken out of the democratic process where it belongs and put into the courts or put into collusive settlements. And so it's important that we take this portion out of it. We're, again, opening our cities and counties up to huge, expensive, and potential problematic litigation as well. So for democracy, I urge members to vote yes. And Madam Speaker, I request a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing there are 15 hands, seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion. Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the roll call on this amendment because I think it's important. We're talking a bit about democracy, and what this does is it removes the right of Minnesotans who face discrimination from vindicating their rights in court. And I was going to wait until third reading to sort of talk about what this is about, but just because it came up, you know, Minnesota, we have taken great strides for a system of free and fair elections, pro-voter bills, but like many other metrics in Minnesota, significant racial inequalities exist in voting, in participation, and representation in our political system. Our history of public and private discrimination against Native Americans, people of color, and language minorities, and racial disparities exist to this day, continue to impair the opportunity of Minnesotans to fully participate in the process. I will not read the entire quote from the House Select Committee on Racial Justice that that happened in 2021, but it talks about the significant racial disparities that are some of the worst in the nation as measured by racial gaps across systems of unemployment, income, wealth, incarceration rates, arrest rates, et cetera. These racial disparities continue to exist in voter participation. According to the census, 79.9% of white citizens voted, but only 66% of black citizens, 64% of Asian citizens, 62% of Latino citizens, and 49% in Native American voting districts. These disparities may or may not be related to discrimination, but as a testifier today or in committee said, we better make sure that they aren't the reason that we have these disparities. That's what this bill does. Now, the reason that this is, I'm glad we have a roll call on this, is that the Eighth Circuit's decision was a matter of statutory interpretation. That was the court saying, I don't think Congress, when Congress wrote this law, I don't think that they provided private right action. If you vote on this, it's a policy choice. As lawmakers were saying that somebody who has potentially been discriminated against in a map or in a practice can't vindicate their own rights. When we provide legal protections, they have to rely on the county attorney or the attorney general and their discretion to decide whether they can vindicate those rights. Members, if you agree with me that I think if a civil rights means anything, people should be able to vindicate those rights, I'd ask you to vote red, and I'm glad you requested a roll call.
Discussion. The member from Wright, Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wasn't planning on speaking to this amendment, but just in response to the comments from Representative Greenman, I find a couple of things interesting. One, the fact that there are certain jurisdictions, certain precincts in areas that I think you might otherwise argue are victims of the type of discrimination that you're talking about that turn out to vote pretty well. I mean, Elon Omar's district is not having a voter turnout problem. You might see it in North Minneapolis, and the reason why might have something to do with the people that I've talked to in that community, who say that the reason why they don't turn up to vote is because, in their judgment, it doesn't make a difference. And they're saying that in the context of a trifecta. We saw it in committee in Children and Families a couple of weeks ago. You're dealing with communities who don't feel like they're being heard, who don't feel like they're being represented, who don't feel like no matter what they do at the ballot box, it's going to make any difference in their lives. So I would suggest that rather than trying to play games in the judicial space, claiming discrimination, you actually talk to people and ask them, why aren't you turning out to vote? I certainly assume that the implication is not that they don't know how, or that they're somehow incapable of doing so. And if they were being kept from doing so in some material fashion, I'm pretty sure you'd be bringing that evidence to bear. But you're not. They're not turning out because they don't feel like it matters. Spend some time talking to them.
Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative Hudson, for those comments. Thank you, Representative Greenman, for the discussion again. Representative Greenman, it was interesting the way that you framed this, that racial disparities continue to exist, and they may or may not relate to discrimination. Well, if we can identify reasons why state action is causing or contributing to those discriminatory problems, we should be doing something about it. We should be taking care of it. We shouldn't be punting it to the courts or punting it to go find a lawyer and sue about it. This is just opening up litigation risk to our cities and our counties who answer to us. They answer to us. So if we decide that they should be doing something different, we should just tell them. Instead of saying to some voting rights group, which may or may not be a partisan group or may not have sympathies with some partisan group, to go find a defendant who maybe will agree with them and agree to some injunction that changes policy and put some new burden on a city and a county. And again, take the choices that should be made in this room by those of us who are accountable to our voters and put it behind closed doors or in a courtroom where people don't see what's happening. Again, if we're for democracy, we shouldn't be for that. We should be for us as the politically accountable people making those policy decisions. That means you should vote yes.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Will the clerk call the name of the member voting remotely?
Engen.
Engen votes aye.
Engen votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 yeas and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There are no more amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House Law Number 4772, as amended.
Third reading. Discussion on third reading. The member from Carver, Representative Nash.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Elections bills are always things that we should be taking look at very importantly. We should work very hard to make them bipartisan. Sadly, that's not happening. I remember back in the good old days, even when we were in the minority, that Representative O'Driscoll and others, we worked to make sure that things were bipartisan. We don't have any of that here. Chair Nelson is over there, others were over there, making sure that because elections are vitally important, that they should be viewed as in a bipartisan lens. Governor Dayton, throughout his tenure, made sure. Governor Walz, in his first term, decided that that was important. And then I guess you all must have changed his mind. But members, this is a bill that has zero Republican input. I had a bill of mine in last year's bill, and then it died in committee or somewhere along the way. That was gravely disappointing. But members, we should be putting our best face on for elections and say that it should be bipartisan. It's not. So I think that everybody should vote no, even you all. I think you can find the courage to vote no on your bill because it has zero Republican input. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to just speak on one portion of this bill. I think there's a number of great provisions, but I will focus on the census reallocation portion. So prison gerrymandering is an unfortunate flaw in our census collection system that over time has led to imbalances in the population count. And when the census first began, the main concern was the relative population between states, and that data is used to determine representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. But as the U.S. grew, states started using the census population data to determine local jurisdictions and their state-level representation. But what this means is that, and this provision is meant to end what has been known as a practice called prison gerrymandering. Because what happens is jurisdictions that contain prisons can count these incarcerated persons as residents and attain a boost in representation in their areas based on imbalanced numbers, without the participation of those incarcerated people in the community of that prison. And what it also means is that the home communities where prisoners had come from have lost a portion of their political power in the state because of that population miscount. There are prisons throughout our state in districts that are currently represented by both parties, and the impact of having that reallocation would actually be felt across the board. While the Census Bureau has not yet decided to act, Minnesota can use its power to reallocate the data that comes from the census every 10 years to ensure a more accurate count. And the provisions in this bill lay out that the 2030 census and beyond, the Minnesota Department of Corrections and the Legislative Coordinating Commission will begin to reallocate incarcerated persons in state and federal prisons to the census blocks where they came from, rather than just the jurisdiction of the prison. And we'll make sure that that data closely tracks the census categories so that way the reallocation can happen smoothly. And then finally, those without a last known address or an address outside of the state or do not wish to provide an address, that incarcerated person will be included in the statewide count. I will also want to be clear on the issue of funding, as that was brought up earlier. Over the years, the number of local jurisdictions that have actually adopted this policy, there has actually not been a change in the allocation of funding. And primarily that's because most federal funding comes in block grants to the state, and it doesn't actually need the prison population to do that. It takes the population of the entire state. And also, according to studies from the Prison Policy Institute, no federal or state funding formula is distributed on the basis of state or local redistricting data. And that has been confirmed by decades of experience of hundreds of local governments that have excluded prison populations when drawing local districts without an effect on the funding they receive. Additionally, 11 states, including the likes of New York and Montana, have implemented this reform. And in 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld this policy as constitutional in Fletcher v. Lamone. So members, I would encourage a green vote on this bill to ensure that we recognize all of our community members. And by starting now, we can prepare for a 2030 census and ensure that Minnesotans are being counted and represented fairly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Crow Wing, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. House File 4772 does nothing to guarantee that people will live in the district when it comes to redistricting. Doesn't address that. Does not address the fact that nonprofits that receive government funds can stick those funds into campaigns. You no longer need to have a physical address to register to vote. I mean, crazy. We'll be having people voting in our elections who are here illegally. They will be voting in our elections. This bill does nothing to address that. Quite the opposite, actually. This legislation continues to do nothing to bring security to our elections, and our elections need security. Provisional ballots, you had an awesome opportunity to get behind Representative Quam's amendment tonight and help secure our elections. I just wonder if the public's thinking, gosh, maybe Democrats don't want to secure our election. I'm not saying that, but they could be definitely saying that. Do Democrats really want to secure our elections? Because you're doing everything to the opposite of that effect. This bill does nothing to restore confidence in our elections. In fact, again, it does just the opposite of that. And let me tell you, I would really like you to pay attention to this fact right here. Minnesotans, their confidence in our elections has been shaken. And if you want to scream conspiracy theory at me, I'll just remind you that former candidate for president, Hillary Clinton, just the other night, said that Republicans were gearing up to steal the 2024 election. So it seems like it's okay for one side to point that out, but not the other. This does nothing to restore Minnesota's confidence in our elections. But you know what? Minnesota's on to you. And I'm just wondering if my colleagues across the aisle, they love it when we bring up election integrity. Minnesotans, let me tell you what they're going to do. They're going to come out in the 2024 election like never before in droves because they're going to be motivated. And this bill does not have bipartisan support. We need to secure our elections, we need to restore confidence in our elections, and we need to have bipartisan support in our elections, folks. Vote no on this terrible election bill.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am really proud of this election, Madam Speaker, excuse me. I'm really proud of this elections bill that our chair and our committee put together. We have been working to strengthen the freedom to vote and expand inclusive, multiracial, multi-generational, gender-inclusive participation in our democracy. And as you can tell from the provisions in this bill, we're still working on that. That continues. As you can see, as it relates to expanding access, we're going to ensure that college students actually have access to early voting. We're going to ensure that folks are counted where they come from, not where they happen to be incarcerated. And we are going to ensure that Minnesota now has a law on the books that deals with racial discrimination in voting. Because until we pass this law, there's no law in Minnesota that has that provision. So I will just keep this very brief and say, you know, in an era of federal courts hostile to voting rights protections, I think it's imperative that we do our jobs in Minnesota to protect Minnesotans and their voters. And I agree with you, Representative Niska, and we had this conversation. We should ensure that local jurisdictions have the ability to deal with and find and solve problems of racial discriminatory effects when they exist. This bill includes the ability for statutory cities to be able to go to ward elections, and it includes the ability for jurisdictions to be able to deal with polling place issues, the two most common things that arise under this bill. So we share that in common. Lastly, I just say this is the time to pass this this bill and to continue the work to ensure that everybody in our democracy has a voice and that our decisions, everybody can participate. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And a couple quick points. There's documented in state recount process, hundreds of votes were found in the trunk. They got counted, ran in the total. There were precincts with more votes than voters who voted. That got counted, that got put in the total. This bill does not correct those issues that are documented in the past. Former Rep. Khan brought to the attention hundreds of people that were registered at a P.O. Box store. Several of them were convicted of voter fraud. This bill expands the issue of they actually had addresses that the post office could deliver to. You're adding addresses that the post office doesn't even recognize. This bill is flawed. It's not bipartisan. We should vote no.
The member from Brown, Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a few points to wrap up this debate this evening. First, I need to talk a little bit about the deep fake provisions in this bill. We haven't spent much time on it tonight, but there are some problems with that. One being the First Amendment. The other side of the aisle has been anxious, it seems, to tear apart our Constitution, but news organizations in particular have First Amendment rights, and this bill does not protect those First Amendment rights. In fact, if they would air a deep fake presentation, identifying it as a deep fake, there's a potential that they could be held accountable for that. If we had a little more time, I'd like to talk to Representative Stevenson about that, but I see he's busy, so I'll let him go at this time. There's also egregious penalties that would actually remove a candidate from office from the ballot. The potential for this deep fake work to be held, used in a way that would eliminate a candidate from the ballot is egregious. That is, the potential there for this to be abused with a double deep fake is horrible. Finally, we have a letter in front of us. I don't think it was handed out, but a letter I received from the League of Minnesota Cities and the Minnesota Association of County Officers, pointing out the extra expenses and time involved in doing what's required in this bill without the proper funding to do it. Another unfunded mandate from the DFL. Finally, we've seen great examples of bipartisan work on bills on this floor in the last few days. This is not one of them. This is a purely partisan bill. This bill is not bipartisan. We could have done bipartisan work in committee. We've been canceled committee hearings in the last week where we could have been hearing Republican bills, at least get our ideas out in the public, but no, we didn't. This does not improve election security, nor does it ensure public confidence in our election bills. Madam Speaker and members, I urge a red vote.
To the author of the bill, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for the robust debate tonight, members. I appreciate all of your comments. First of all, related to this argument about bipartisanship, I mean, there are broadly popular provisions included in this bill, supported by people of all parties. Beyond that, I've made efforts to hear Republican bills. I scheduled one for a hearing, and then the author told me not to hear it. We've accepted GOP amendments both in committee and on the floor. But setting all that aside, let's focus on the positives of this bill. This bill corrects historical wrongs and federal mistakes. It improves the clarity of how our elections are influenced, and it expands voter access for eligible voters. I'd like to thank Vice Chair Greenman and Lead Torkelson for a good committee. Committee Administrators Wilson Lee and Simon Brown for their work, Committee Legislative Assistant Mike Hermanson, DFL Researcher John Buehler, GOP Researcher Jacob Grundhauser, nonpartisan staff Matt Gehring and Helen Roberts, Committee Page Joe Schatz, and members of the committee. Members, please vote yes for this bill.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll.
Will the clerk please call the name of the member who's voting remotely?
Engen.
Do it again.
Engen votes no.
Engen votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 69 ayes and 62 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.